I feel like we.
Right.
So I just like coach or like.
Right.
Just probably a little bit.
When they call your name.
You know, he's not listening.
Right. And the
Are you?
Okay, and it's
Oh,
summer.
summer.
Actually,
Howard,
it's
can you get it set up?
Yeah.
Okay.
think Carrie wants to say.
Okay.
You're fine, you don't have to move.
But it just, it's like, look at my draw.
I promise not to.
You're gonna be the first
I know.
person.
I showered this morning.
I did it too.
I think I was an hour and a half.
Feel
You
like
can sit next to me.
I
I won't bite
Yeah.
all those
Well, you can
things.
go into.
You know, doing the.
Okay. I would just go on Zoom because it doesn't make it like show her person. Then you're just showing it.
We don't have.
I mean,
Exactly.
maybe
Putting on my photos.
Right. Yeah, you don't have a card. Just go on Zoom. Right. Okay, that's really good to know. Because they definitely. Maybe they'll just like make it quick.
Why?
Next week.
As they definitely were like, be at the courthouse at 8:30 a.m. June 20th.
Well, that's what I'm.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's just like, in my head, I was like, oh my.
Well, that's probably.
Okay.
Like,
I was like, maybe it's like she's always there.
oh, okay. Oh, that's
As
so
opposed to
true.
having to wait
And
another
like,
50 minutes.
okay,
For-
that's great. That would make it
Yeah.
so much better.
Okay,
Yeah.
there it is.
Can you guys hear me?
Sorry, Carrie just left. She is around.
Alright, let me grab her.
She might be in the break room.
Wow.
Carrie's here.
Okay.
Strategically.
Very cool.
That's a cool, I've never seen this new background.
Wes!
And it's live.
Which way? That way.
Somebody has. Oh, no, it's like.
That way? That way.
Hi,
Hey Wes,
Highway.
how are you?
we're just gathering. We actually officially start at 1:40, so
Oh,
you have a few minutes until the room fills up.
all right.
I like your book in the background.
Very subtle.
How are you, sir?
I'm good. How are you doing?
Yeah. It's been better.
It's been better. It's probably been worse too. What do you say?
Wes's university is on one of the centers that was one of the 7 that got the notice at the same time we did. So,
Okay.
the University of New Orleans one. Are you guys on 2 of them? No, just that one.
We're on another one, but the other one is safe. The other one's from North Dakota. And
Right, that was the only one that got terminated.
yeah. I mean, the title of that center was the Center for Equitable Transit-Oriented Communities. So I was telling them in November that we should change the name,
Yeah.
and we didn't change it till February, maybe.
Oh.
Or then it was too late.
Yeah. I don't
It
know.
probably wouldn't have mattered anyways. I think
I was gonna say, there's other centers that haven't been canceled yet that have more, just as provocative of names. So,
yeah, New Orleans was the only one in a red state for sure that got canceled. All the other ones were not bad.
yeah. Either California or New York or Maryland.
Yep.
How busy are you? You still doing your book tours repeatedly, or has it slowed down?
I had a little bit of less travel because of that cancellation, so this one.
Yeah.
I was supposed to be in New Orleans 2 weeks ago, so that was canceled too.
Okay. I was telling these guys that they were like, so Wes isn't coming in person, and I was like, as soon as I let him off the hook, he was like, yeah, I'm not coming. And I told them why, how busy you've been with the book.
Well, that and two, we had 9 students working on projects related to the grant that got terminated.
Okay.
I mean, my goal is to shift money towards them as opposed to me taking trips if possible.
Yeah. We've got 40 students or something like that.
Yeah,
Postdocs and.
you're in a similar
yeah.
boat.
I just find, yeah, it's something like that she's seen here. It's very fun.
Yeah.
Yeah, we got like 8 more minutes until the room fills up. We did a little book club before.
How was it?
It was good. A few of the people in the room were here for that. Do you guys have any questions for Wes about the
Yeah, sure.
book before he goes into?
Was the stream of consciousness form of the book a conscious like decision to do so? It's just like your style, or like was it like also an intentional decision to keep it that way?
It was intentional. You know, I knew the book was going to be very different than like my academic writing, so I wanted to really make that distinction and not have them be sort of the same. But I also wanted to be the kind of thing that, you know, maybe some buddies from college of mine would read and not have to be transportation nerds to enjoy necessarily. Um, at the same time, I'm literally talking about kids dying, so if there's not a little levity or my personality in it, it might be kind of this a tough read, you know?
Yeah, for sure. I feel like the others are shy. Sampath is never shy. You have any questions for us?
You got posted notes in there, I see. Is that where you're continuing on, or is that, okay, or notes?
You get to be my conclusion this quarter. You're the last one.
Say that again?
That's for last.
You get to be my conclusion. You're the
Oh.
last seminar for us as we go into summer, so. These guys are all overwhelmed with classes and trying to finish out the quarter.
Do you guys have like exam week this week, next week? What's going on?
It's 2, so we have one more week next week. We usually don't do seminar in the last week of the quarter because everybody's so overwhelmed from projects and stuff. And then exam week is the week after that, so we still have a little bit. You got a question?
Yeah, it's,
All right, Sampath has a question, Wes.
All right.
thanks for joining in. I heard about your book back when I was in India from the head of transportation safety in the city of Chennai. It's great to see you again here in the US while reading your book. My question is regarding, so in one of the chapters in your book, you talked about how we need to talk near misses as near hits. I'm totally in for that.
Yeah,
We're currently
we decided we're totally doing that. We're doing work on near misses. They are now near hits.
Yes, if you nearly miss something, you hit it. It's like, wait, why do we call them?
So I totally agree on the terminology of that. And my question is related to, I mean, you've certainly presented this argument of the Dutch being more open to more conflicts, which sort of makes the system safer in general because people are more conscious. Now we're doing this research on near misses, and we're looking at metrics which are relevant to actual transportation. If you have to like course correct the research direction on the way we have to look or think about near misses, what would you advise on that?
There you go. He's using you for his research, Wes.
So, yeah, I mean, I've been saying this for a while, but mostly we haven't really integrated into research yet. We're sort of thinking about it to some extent. I mean, I'm happy to share it because I think it's important. I would say that near hits, it's not a binary, right? It's not yes or no, it's a spectrum. So like a near hit at 10 miles an hour might be good. A near hit at 70 miles an hour is really bad. And there's a spectrum in between. So I think we need to sort of figure out where in that spectrum is it good and where does it start shifting towards bad and how that might depend upon the context. I think it's a lot more complicated than a lot of that, conventional near miss literature that I've seen. Like it's more like, they treat it almost like a crash and it's going to be a proxy for safety, just near misses in general. And I don't think that's necessarily true.
All right, I see that it's 1:40. I think we have a pretty full room, so let's get started. I am super excited. Our last week, I am bringing to you guys a good friend of mine who I've known for a very long time, Dr. West. See the eyebrows go up. We were both young and had tiny kids. I don't even know if he had kids yet the first time that we met.
I had a 1-month-old.
Okay, yeah. I had a 1-year-old and Wes had a 1-month-old the first time. Dr. Wes Marshall is a professor at the University of Colorado at Denver. In both, his appointment is in civil engineering. He also has an appointment, teaches, works with people in urban city planning.
It's technically a joint appointment, but it's
Okay.
the way the money works is 100% civil, 0% planning.
So that's how it works here too.
Yeah.
He did his undergrad degree at the University of Virginia. He did his master's and Ph.D. at the University of Connecticut, which is where Wes and I met. I was actually an instructor of his before I had a Ph.D. Were you doing your Ph.D. at that point? Or your master's? His PhD?
I was doing them simultaneously, so it was a master's/PhD. Yeah.
He has gone on to really great things from there. You should definitely look at more of his work other than just the book. But he has had quite a bit of success in getting attention with his book. For those of you who haven't had a chance to take a look at it, let me know. We have plenty of copies floating around. You should absolutely at least skim it, if not read the whole thing. It has brought a lot of attention to a subject that Wes and I have long talked about, like the roots and origins of our fields and where we're going wrong with those. So today, have you tested your slides? Are you ready for slides? Do you have slides? I assume you have slides. Awesome.
Can you see them?
Yes. So today, Wes is going to talk to you guys about the origin story of the high injury network. So this is just one component of the book. I think he's probably happy to take questions about other components for those of you who did read the book. So with that, I will turn it over. Thank you, Wes.
Thank you, Carrie, and thanks everyone for joining me. And Carrie, I don't even know if you remember this, but I did mention this title of the book probably like 12 years ago at a lunch we used to have at TRB every year. You guys all laughed like, oh, that'd be funny, but it turned out to be the real book eventually. All right, so I am going to talk about the book, but part of it is going to be this origin story of the high injury network. Before I get to that, I thought it'd be useful to do a little bit of my origin story because I grew up in Watertown, Massachusetts. This is a town founded a couple hundred years before traffic engineers ever existed. And like to me as a kid, like this was the big road next to where I grew up. Just one lane of traffic in each direction, on-street parking on either side. I think it's only 34 feet curb to curb. Turn the other way, this was considered the big intersection I would have to cross to get to like my favorite pizza place, or it was actually a great sandwich shop right up the street there. And again, this so-called big intersection was still just one lane in each direction, both ways. I never thought much about transportation back then, but we still avoided those kind of slightly bigger roads when we could, and we mostly biked around on streets like this one. So this is the street kind of right adjacent to my house. It's only 24 feet curb to curb. It felt so small and so slow because again, had parking on both sides. This is not a picture of me and my friends, but we also felt like we could walk or bike anywhere in town. And as I got older and wanted to venture further out, we could jump on the bus and get to Fenway Park or Harvard Square. And like from there, the red line could take us pretty much anywhere. As Carrie mentioned, I went to University of Virginia. I was at Charlottesville. And I was getting a degree in civil engineering. And again, transportation wasn't my focus at first. Even though UVA spent the entirety of my 4 years widening Route 29 that cuts through Charlottesville, the students, I mean, we were pretty much insulated from that. But one thing I did notice is that the traffic on 29 was just as bad, if not worse, when I left after all the improvements as compared to when I got there. So after I graduated, after UVA, I went back to the Boston area, went back to Watertown. I started working as a civil engineer for what was considered to be a pretty progressive firm. I was doing more site engineering type work, and that's the kind of work it means a little bit of being a jack of all trades. So you're doing transportation, but you're also doing maybe some structural, geotech. I was doing a lot of hydrology. But it was interesting because it was the transportation pieces that most frustrated me. And it felt like the stuff we were building, even at what was really a good firm doing great work, was never as good as the stuff I saw in and around me. Yeah, for those of you that have, started in the consulting world or such right after your undergraduate, once you're in the job and you're doing transportation work, you're given like a half a dozen of these 1,000-page manuals, you have them all on your desk, and you rely on them, and you rely on them quite a bit because most of us have taken maybe one or two transportation engineering courses as an undergrad. In fact, I know some people that became PEs in transportation that had never taken a single transportation engineering course at all because it's not actually required as part of our accreditation. You need sort of four subdisciplines, and transportation doesn't need to be a part of it. But I will say that those manuals, if you look, it makes it kind of hard, if not impossible, to design some of the streets that I grew up near. Or this is Calm Ave. This is near Boston as well. This is a multi-way boulevard. You see the train in the middle, like access lanes on the far right side, mobility lanes in the middle. Little to no dedicated parking for any of these buildings. And nowhere in this book could I find anything close to this street. This is Acorn Street in the Beacon Hill neighborhood of Boston, and they say it's the most photographed street in the United States. I'm not quite sure if that's true or not, but there are usually lots of people. I was able to capture one photo with no one around, but it's usually a lot more crowded. Anyways, I then changed jobs and I moved to maybe a more traditional civil engineering firm out in Connecticut. And this was the first time I ever lived in a place that I could not leave my street without being in a car. This was the street I lived on. It was big roads and big parking lots as far as the eye could see, sidewalks, bike lanes, bike facilities, non-existent. I moved to a smaller town in Connecticut thinking it would be better. And even though the adjacent street was much smaller, it still wasn't one where people really feel safe walking or biking. And this honestly drove me crazy. In fact, this, Sal's corner stores, literally called the corner store, should have been what it was, a 5-minute walk from where I lived. And you couldn't walk there. You really had to get in a car if you wanted to go over to this place. And I would ask my neighbors and friends like how they live like this, and nobody really understood what I was talking about. Nobody really understood what they were missing. They'd be like, just drive, and I'd be like, oh my God, like what is happening? But eventually, these frustrations led me to apply to graduate school, and I did so right after I got my PE in transportation. I ended up going to UConn, and when I arrived, my advisor, who Carrie knows, Norman Garrick, he put me on a parking project, and he left town to go on sabbatical. He takes a lot of sabbaticals, if you know Norman. And my thinking at the time was parking, that's kind of boring. You go back to grad school, you're looking for something exciting. But prior to leaving, he gave me one name, which was Donald Shoup, who I'm sure, as you know, sadly passed away recently. But this was still before the high cost of free parking came out. So there wasn't like the Shoup book, there wasn't the Shoupistas, that sort of stuff. But I dug into a lot of his research on parking and transportation in cities. And as early as like 2004, I was, making slides like this one based on, the parking generation book. You know, I think one of the first lessons I really learned from Donald's work is the shocking lack of science behind numbers like we see in these books. Here's like one example from the parking generation where it's telling you we need 10.60 vehicles per 1,000 square feet of gross floor area. And if you graph that on this chart, it would look like this. But if you actually look at the data does, something more like this. And like that mentality sort of stuck with me through the years. And we were writing this is my first paper that I ended up having published in TRR. And what we did in this paper is we looked at three New England town centers that were built well before traffic engineers existed, and three that were built in more contemporary times where the parking regulations and ordinances existed. And you can see, for instance, just how much land is dedicated to parking. Like the pinkish color is the parking, the hatch beige color is the buildings. And we went out there dozens of times to try to really find the busiest day of the year in terms of parking occupancy. So like Black Friday in the summer, all over the place. And on the busiest day of the year, this is just one example. Like this is what we saw in terms of parking occupancy. Only one parking lot you would consider to be full. Most of them were less than 20% full. But when you talk to everyone, like we did surveys as part of this too, and everyone, when you asked them what the parking problem was, they would all say they needed more parking. And if you look at these places differently, it just wasn't the case. So you start asking yourself questions like, why do we do this? Like, why do we want to provide more parking than necessary? And part of it is we're scared of stories like this. You see articles like how the UK ran out of spaces, the $1 million parking spot. So with this, like the idea of being conservative typically means providing more parking than we think we need. What does that lead to? And this is a office supply store near me in Denver here, which I think there's 6 times more land dedicated to parking than the building itself. Or this is one I biked past just this morning on the way in. It's a 12-story building where 7 of the floors are taken up by parking and only 5 are apartments. But why do we do this? Well, one reason is the fear of the sort of things we were just talking about. Another reason is that transportation engineering, I should say, is a subdiscipline of civil engineering. So when I was an undergraduate, I'm taking courses in structural, hydrology, geotech. In courses like that, we figure out what the design load needs to be, we multiply it by 3 to give ourselves that factor of safety. But anything bigger is better. A bigger beam might cost us a little bit more, but it's going to be safer. Same goes with a culvert. Like this factor of safety mentality kind of seeps through all of civil engineering. And it makes perfect sense when it comes to a beam or a culvert or a building. But the factor of safety mentality doesn't work as well in transportation. Why? Well, Mother Nature doesn't care how big our beam is. It's not going to be any windier. But if you put a wider road in front of a human, they may behave differently. All right, so what does this mean in terms of roadway design? Well, here's a picture I took. This is actually about a year ago. I was going up to the ITE conference in Big Sky, Montana. This is right outside of Yellowstone, sort of West Yellowstone. And if you look at it, it is a good example of what might be considered a perfectly well-engineered road. Like the area to the right, where I'm taking the picture from, is, to the right of this is the area we would call the clear zone. And here's a diagram of the clear zone, which gives us, in some sense, that factor of safety. So we define a clear zone as that unobstructed, traversable roadside area where we want out of control drivers to stop and stop safely and be able to regain control of their vehicle if it's left the roadway. And if you look at this is from the most recent AASHTO roadside design guide. Now they're looking at upwards of over 30 feet in this suggestion. So one of the things I tried to do in the book is try to figure out where these things sort of came from. Like where and when did this concept originate? This one I track back to this 1963 roadside design guidebook by what's called the ASF, the Automotive Safety Foundation. In it, they referenced this study from Virginia, which found that 25% of the runoff the road drivers hit trees. And their solution was simple. Let's just remove all the trees within 15 feet of the roadway. Well, what happens if you do that? Well, one thing is clear, fewer drivers hit trees, but does it actually help overall safety? That is something that the same 1963 book made clear that we don't know the answer to. All they did was count how many cars hit trees, not whether people would be safer with or without trees being there in the first place. Nevertheless, our main design agency, like now known as AASHTO, was AASHTO at the time, they forged ahead with that clear zone concept, and this would be the 1967 Manual on Highway Safety, which you might have heard of as the Yellow Book. And they introduced this idea with a similar study, just counting all the fatal crashes that happened in 1965 of people that ran off the road and hit trees on what they called the safest facilities ever devised. And this is the table that was in my undergraduate textbook. What does it insinuate? Well, the column on the left shows us the bigger and bigger clear zones. The one on the right shows us the reduction in crashes we'll see. So in other words, the bigger we make the clear zone, the safer we all be. I mean, if you read the fine print, it's related crash types, but the impression I got is just bigger is better, bigger is safer. And you can see we built that here. At the other end of the spectrum is the mountain here in Colorado, formerly known as Mount Evans. This is now called Mount Blue Sky. It's the highest, I think, paved road in North America. It goes up past 14,000. And if you live in Colorado for a while, at some point you might have driven up this. But if you have, you know that this road has absolutely zero clear zone. And this is a narrow 2-lane road, up, one down. If you look at the data for this roadway, this road also, as the Colorado DOT says here, has very few crashes, despite this narrow width, despite its lack of clear zone, no guardrails. Why? I think it's simple. Like, you behave very differently on these two roadways, right? Like, you can't afford to make a mistake on one of them, so you're white knuckling it all the way up the roadway. The other one's not a big deal, so you might look down at your phone or whatever. You might be going faster. Which road is actually safer? It's not always that simple. If you look more closely at the Yellowstone Road, you'll see that sign off to the right there. If you pay attention, if you drive up that roadway, you'll see dozens of these little white crosses along that stretch, representing people that died on the roadway. So I'm definitely not saying that clear zones are definitively safe or unsafe. What I'm saying that is just not as clear cut as traffic engineers would lead us to believe. It's not as clear cut as I was led to believe as like someone in transportation engineering. Here's a highway in Florida. Compare that to this one in Saskatchewan. You look at the data, the one on the left is way safer. And this is at least I went to like a new urbanist conference, and this was like the well-regarded cross-section of what the Florida DOT has been trying to put through urban areas. So remember that definition we talked about what a clear zone is? That's the area where we want an out-of-control driver to recover. Look at closely at the clear zone on this. Like, who do we put in that clear zone? Like, that's where there's, intentionally placing the pedestrians and the bicyclists in that recovery zone. Like, does it make any sense to put heads and bikes in the area where we want run off the road drivers to regain control of their vehicles? Of course not. But still, designs like this that may actually have a sidewalk or a bike lane like this one are a big improvement over a lot of what we've put out there in the world. All right, so I start my book off comparing traffic engineers to doctors because doctors have been around for 5,000 or so years. It wouldn't be hard to argue with it for the first 1,000 of those years. You can make the case that they probably killed more people than they saved. But as an empirical science, they got better and better. Transportation engineering, traffic engineering, we're only about 100 years old. And it wouldn't also be hard to argue that we're still on the stage where we're killing more people than we save. So what I was trying to do in the book is, again, not just point out what we're doing wrong, but really understand why, like dive down those rabbit holes to figure out why we do what we do. So if you've read the book, you'll see I read, hundreds of old journal articles to try to kind of get to the bottom of those rabbit holes to find those origin stories. Like, for instance, this is one of them. Like the idea, I guess the general idea that wider roads are safer. Um, I tracked it back to this 1934 study that showed that a 22-foot wide roadway was safer than a 20 and safer than an 18-foot wide roadway. Then there was one from 1945 that showed us that a 24-foot wide roadway was safer than a 22, 20, or 18-foot wide roadway. For a while, we told people that wider roads are safer, and we cited those studies. So if you follow that, we actually cited these studies up through like the 60s. And then around that time, we stopped citing them. So we kept on promoting this idea that wider roads are safer. And that wider roads is safer mantra is what I was taught, but we stopped studying the initial research. And we know today that a 20-foot wide roadway, like curb to curb, is way smaller than almost anything we'd build today. But we didn't really extrapolate the research like we should have. So we built wide roads like this one. This is Zelza Avenue near Cal State Northridge in LA. And one question I want to pose, like when an engineer looks at a street like this, how would you figure out what the speed limit would be? As I'm sure most all of you know, we'd use something called the 85th percentile speed, where you figure out, how fast every car is going on the road, and you start cumulatively adding those up. And once you hit around that 85th number, or the 86th in this case, we would set the speed limit somewhere around then. Like you might take the step of doing these histograms where you show the mean, the median, the pace, all that sort of stuff. Given the distribution, you come up with your speed limit based on where that 85th number typically is. But why do we do this? Like this one tracks back to David Solomon and the Solomon curves from the mid 60s. And he used data from the 1950s to study what he called the involvement rate of crashes at different speeds. So for instance, in this curve, you can see that the lowest involvement rate is sort of at the bottom of the reverse Nike swoosh there. around like 55 or 65 miles per hour. So what he was saying here is that if we're going that fast, we're going to get better safety. And if you look at the table from his studies, you can see that you get the worst safety at the slowest speeds. Like, does this approach work? Well, I could tell you that the Solomon curves might be useful for access management, but they've been debunked many times over. Um, they took place on all rural roads in Texas in the 1950s, and all these seemingly dangerous slow drivers were usually just trying to turn into or out of gas stations when they were hit by much faster drivers from behind. I could also tell you that the NTSB, National Transportation Safety Board, tells us there's no strong evidence that using the 85th percentile helps safety whatsoever. But I could also show you what this sort of thinking would lead us to. Like here's Zelza Avenue again. Back when it had a speed limit of 35 miles an hour, this would be 2009. A 60-year-old woman, I think her name was Victoria Ramos, was killed on this in a crosswalk on the street. A few months later, a 19-year-old student from Cal State Northridge was killed on the same street. So the city did a safety study. They did a speed study, and they found that 68% of drivers were speeding along this stretch. Given numbers like that and these recent deaths, you'd expect some drastic changes. So what did the city end up doing? They raised the speed limit. So when they did that, it became even more dangerous. I think they had 13 ped bike crashes over the next couple of years over a short 2-mile stretch near campus. So they did another safety study, another speed study, and they found an 85th percentile speed of 48. So they raised the speed limit again, this time to 45. And for whatever reason, they ended up erasing that school zone, even that school thing is there. So what's next? If you like follow this logic and you follow, in the words of maybe Eleanor Roosevelt, like inevitably you're going to end up just going on and on and on. But I will say they since dropped the speed limit back to 40. Maybe some common sense came back into play. And, California had some other issues that I'm sure you know of in terms of when they can and can't enforce speed limits. But you can see how we took this hypothesis that only pace matters, raw speed doesn't matters, and we kind of put that into play in our actions. So thinking about this, like one of the assignments I sometimes use in my class, I call it like the Charming Streets case study project, where they try to find a street they love, and they figure out what hurdles they'd have to face in trying to turn a street like Zelza Avenue into one that they love. So take one like this, and how do you take a street like this and turn it more into the other one? And they always have to be like the same functional classification, but the idea is more to look at, is it the manuals? Is it the municipal regulations? Is it the fight? What could it be that would keep us from doing so? Um, I think as we all know, we're not going to be able to use like green stop signs, but for the most part, these manuals are more on the guideline side than the standard side. So these manuals were rarely the barrier to doing what we wanted to do. Like there was usually enough flexibility built into these to do what they would want or need. So while the manuals didn't often get in the way, it was sometimes the fire marshal or the International Fire Code, but more often than not, the biggest hurdle was actually level of service. I'm sure you all know what level of service. I'm going to go through this part a little bit quickly. I could spend, I think Carrie saw me do like a 45-minute presentation on just this, but if you go down this rabbit hole, it leads you to the 1965 Highway Capacity Manual, and it leads you to a man named O.K. Norman, who is known as Mr. Capacity, even though he was studying capacity at a time when there really wasn't congestion problems that we would see today, especially on the multi-lane roadways. But that didn't stop Mr. Capacity. So if you want to see the story how we ended up with these 6 levels of service, you actually have to go back to the previous HCM, which was the 1951. In that one, we had 3 levels, and you can see how they directly translated those. Like possible capacity became E, practical capacity became like the rural and urban side of B and C. And then what I was trying to get across, at least in the book on this chapter, was like just the haphazard nature of how this works. I'm sure you've all been in meetings where it's sort of a little bit of groupthink, and somebody you kind of barely know will raise their hand and say something like, in this case, a guy named Carl. He was worked for the DOT in California. This isn't what Carl actually looks like, but this is what AI thought he would look like. He was He said something to the effect of, and these are just from articles I'm reading about those meetings, that California was able to see a lot more capacity than Mr. Capacity was seeing. So he's like, we need something in between. So he came up with D. And then a guy named Charles from New Jersey. Again, this is not Charles, but he worked for the New Jersey Turnpike, and they were starting to build these, you know, lanes you have to pay for. So he wanted something better than the best. He's like, well, I need something better than that BC. Give me A. So they just kind of threw A in the mix. They went to committee with these five that you see here, and the quotes from around that time, you sort of see how contentious it was. And even before they approved it, they kind of threw F on as a what is called or described as an afterthought or a catch-all. But they gave OK Norman this engraved Mr. Capacity watch. This is not the real watch, but but if you look in the fine details, like one of the things they said is that we really need to incorporate safety into this. At the moment, we don't have enough data to do so, but next time, safety needs to be part of these discussions. If you look at the next iteration of the HCM, they just removed those sentences, like safety and actually operating costs were dropped from the definition of level of service altogether. In fact, I checked every subsequent HCM and I couldn't find safety in any of the indices of any of those manuals. Like related to this, I think we all know, like the urban legend maybe that the early traffic engineers were trying to treat traffic like water in a pipe. And when I read those papers by people that were on that LOS committee, like this one from 1964, they were saying that exactly. Like they were literally saying this, that LOS is based on maximizing the kinetic energy of the traffic stream. Like that was the intent of it. And maximizing the kinetic energy of the traffic stream is not exactly what we want in terms of road safety. But the origin story that I want to tell isn't for LOS, it isn't for Mr. Capacity, it's more for the high injury networks. Because every city can make a map like this as Denver's, where, and for our case, 50% of our fatalities and severe injuries take place in only 5% of the roadways. But sometimes you see 60 on 6% or whatever it might be. But when you start thinking about the the little kind of pieces of the puzzle that I've laid out for you, when you combine the factor safety mentality with the mantra that wider roads are safer and the idea that we need these big clear zones, and then we set our speed limits by letting drivers vote with their feet, all under this level of service system that has nothing to do with safety, but is set up in a way where we need to just embiggen our streets and intersections whenever cars can't go as quite free flow speed in the peak hour or peak 15 minutes. We get roads just like that one I ended up living on when I first moved to Connecticut. Um, right down the street was what? It was the state DOT, on this same street. You see that beautiful crosswalk there? That's what that crosswalk leads to in front of the state DOT. And even worse, this road was by no means safe. It was probably the least safe road in the entire state of Connecticut. Similar things could be said for the Colorado DOT, which is right on Federal Boulevard in Denver. There's the Colorado DOT in the background there. You don't have to go far from it to start seeing just plenty of examples of how unsafe it is, even though the DOT is right behind these things. And in fact, when you look at Denver's high injury network, Federal Boulevard, where the DOT sits, which is 15-minute walk west of here, is the worst of the worst. And when you look at like those roads we built, like those high injury networks, those tend to be the roads we put pretty much all of our traffic engineering know-how into. Like these high injury network roads tend to be our most highly engineered roadways we have, but they're also our least safe. And that's when you start seeing a lot of the disconnects. I recently met her for a drink. The woman in the middle, she used to be the international IT president, Jenny Grote. She graduated from the program where I teach now 41 years ago. She just moved back to here from Arizona. Her professor, the guy you see in the far right there, Daryl Fleming, he was her professor 41 years ago. He happened to be coming through town, so she thought it'd be fun to get the three of us together. So I was asking some questions and trying to get an understanding of how things were back then. And this is an exact quote that he gave me. So he told us that he taught his students to design roads so that 9 out of 10 drunk orangutans would survive driving on it. Like that was the mentality he was trying to get across. So we ended up designing our roads like racetracks. Like this one. This one here is, I think the biggest crosswalk I could find with no median is 245 feet from curb to curb, which, if you estimate 3.5 feet per second would take about 70 seconds to cross. But you can see how all this comes together into just these big roadways, and it just makes perfect sense. All right, so now I want to take a step back and ask a more fundamental question. How safe are we? Because I also want to show you not just the origin story of the Heinz network, but maybe why we're reticent to even fix these problems. Or in part, I think it's a little bit because we don't even realize we have a problem. All right, so if you've been to a road safety conference, I've been to a lot of them. Oftentimes you see an engineer show up and they will put up a slide like this where they are showing us road fatalities through the years. This is our road fatality rate, road fatalities per 100 million vehicle miles traveled from the early 1900s straight up till today. And they give you the impression that it's got better and better and better. Something like to this effect. One thing I see as problematic is that it feels like to me we're measuring the wrong thing. Like, let me give you an example. Like here we have two cities. Let's assume for the sake of this example that they both have the same number of fatalities of 16. People living in the community in the top left, let's say they cumulatively drive 2 billion miles, and the bottom right is 1 billion. So if you calculate our conventional fatality rate, the one on the top left is 2 times safer than the one on the bottom right. But what is probably one thing we can all agree on, that dying on the roads is not great for your health. What happens if we measure it just like the medical profession measures every other health impact? We measure it per population. Now, let's say we have 200,000 people living in the community in the top left and 400,000 in the bottom right. All of a sudden, our thinking flips as to which one is safer. Now, the one on the bottom right is twice as safe as the one on the top left. And this seems so kind of dang obvious, but we focus entirely on that first set of rates. But most humans would define real safety as the second set. I mean, where would you rather live? Where would you rather want like your friends, your family, your kids to grow up in? And this also works for real cities. I did a talk in Wilmington, North Carolina recently, and I found this data before I went. Here we have Raleigh, North Carolina. Back in 2022, they had 62 fatalities. Philadelphia had almost double that with 123. People in Raleigh, on average, they drive like 38 miles per person per day, which adds up to 6.5 billion miles. In Philly, it's more like 21 miles per person per day, but you still get a ton of miles. And if you look at the data, Raleigh's a little bit safer than Philly. But if you measure it like a health impact and you do it per population, all of a sudden Philly is way safer than Raleigh. And for the sake of argument, you could even take that first fake city and instead of 60 fatalities, let's say you had 17. And if you only increase driving by like 8%, all of a sudden you're safer despite having more fatalities. It's like, what's going on here? And this is why TRB put out this report last fall, like basically saying, despite all these fatalities, roads continue to get safer. It's like, wait, what? Like we have more fatalities than we've had in a long time, but our roads are getting safer. It's not really real safety. Because if you think about it, this crash rate, there's two ways to improve safety is one, if the numerator is fatalities, the denominator is vehicle miles traveled, we can either reduce the numerator or we can increase the denominator. And if you look at what VMT has been doing through the years, we've done a heck of a job of increasing it. I think it's increased like 30-fold over the same time span. And populations increased quite a bit too, but only like 2.5 times. So if we measure it per population, like, yes, we're getting safer, but nowhere near as safe as we think we are. So, like I said, I'm trying to figure out why we do these sort of things, and this was one of them. Why do we measure safety like this? This rabbit hole led me to this man, Paul Hoffman. He was the self-proclaimed civic leader of the safety movement. Prior to becoming the civic leader of the safety movement, he was the CEO of the car company Studebaker. Prior to that, he was actually their number one regional salesman. But in the mid 1930s, Paul wasn't happy that cars are being made to look unsafe. He was convinced that the bad publicity was going to hurt his auto sales. He made the right point that we need to have an exposure metric, right? We can all agree with that, but he just simply chose the one he liked best that would help make cars look nice and safe for the time being and hopefully for the foreseeable future. And he wrote a book about it. So here you can see the route he chose. He published this book, Seven Roads to Safety. I actually have a copy back here. This came out in 1939. I had to buy a lot of crazy stuff on eBay to prepare for my book, but this is something that he ended up publishing this book, barnstorming the country. And as I mentioned, he was a pretty good salesperson. So this burgeoning new discipline of traffic engineering, we kind of bought what he was selling. And we ended up codifying this in the US DOT and Congress, I think in 1966. And this is the way we typically still measure safety today. But if we treat it like a health impact and we compare ourselves, for instance, to the other OECD countries, we're typically last or second to last in terms of safety. Like we're at the bottom of the heap. All right, so how do we fix these safety problems? Well, we maybe want to heed the advice of people like Mike Bloomberg. In God we trust, everyone else bring data. This makes perfect sense because we all want a more data-driven approach to road safety. And I remember when Vision Zero was first coming along online, this is probably 10, 11 years ago, I saw a presentation by a traffic engineer with Boulder. Boulder had sort of just declared Vision Zero. In the presentation I saw, they went through what we know as the three E's, the conventional approaches to safety, engineering, education, enforcement. And their thinking was we're going to add this fourth E to the mix, evaluation. What happens when you dig through your data? What do you find? Well, you find that most of our crashes are caused by human error. And if human error is the problem, what do you do in terms of a solution? Well, going back to this list, you're not going to start with education, with engineering. You're going to maybe lean towards education enforcement. So a lot of cities, especially ones that are kicking off Vision Zero, they start with that enforcement route. A lot of them start by cracking down on all the jaywalkers and the scofflaw cyclists. New York City, for instance, I think they issued more tickets to bicyclists than truck drivers. I think they gave like 43 tickets to cyclists, one to a truck driver, even though it was the inverse. 43 people were killed by truck drivers, only one by a bicyclist during that time span. We'll see if you can hear this one, but
Even those who get caught speeding.
Guy in the red helmet's going 16.
Mind stopping, please?
that was them in Washington, D.C. pulling over a bicyclist going 16 and a 15 on a multi-use trail. Black Hawk, Colorado took it a few steps further. They banned bikes completely from city streets, thinking that would fix their safety problem. Although this was deemed unconstitutional by our state Supreme Court. Anyways, I think we don't need to cover all the problems with enforcement, whether it's temporary, like the Big Brother fears with cameras, all that sort of stuff, and the racial impacts as well. So for a lot of places, the low-hanging fruit is education. So when Boulder looked at their crash data and they've realized they had a massive human error problem, they put out this PSA, which is similar to what you see from almost every agency responsible for road safety, like something akin to this. I taught my safety class last fall, and actually this was on the first day of classes. I went up to Red Rocks. If you've heard of that, that's one of our kind of amazing music venues here in the state. And the Colorado DOT on a Monday morning set up this display. They had 3+ rows here, and each sign represented a person that died in the previous year in a speeding related crash in Colorado. So I think there was 257 different signs taking up 3+ rows. And if you look closely at the sign, one thing I noticed is like, oh, that's weird. They have a little SoundCloud thing on each of the signs. I clicked on that and it brings you to this playlist of slow tempo songs. And I was like, that's interesting. Like, what's going on there? So they cited this paper when I started digging into it. Like, here's the paper they cited. And me being who I am, I dug up that study and I found out that it wasn't a study at all. It was just a review of other papers. One of the papers they looked at driver speed as a function of music tempo being played. So I dug up that study, and it turned out to be a study. I think was it from Israel, where they had 20 musical education students that were forced to jump in a driver simulator for the sake of a class in 2002, and they played different tempo music while they drove the driver simulator. And yes, that paper found that music tempo made a difference, but more recent research has seemed to find that it doesn't make a difference. So I'm not saying that it does or it doesn't, but it might be premature for our state DOT to spend time putting together a list of 151 different songs. So if you want some slow music to listen to, but to me, what I found more useful were like the little hearts. Like this means that a kid from this county died in a crash. Here's a 5-year-old kid that died in a speeding related crash. And they died on our street. So when I was sitting up there and you're seeing little kids running around having fun, it's a kid like that that actually died. And to me, that was much more impactful than the music idea. But still, they have a reporter go on TV and tell us all to behave better. And that, to be honest, is the underlying thinking of a lot of transportation engineers is that if everyone just followed the rules we laid out for you, you'd all be safe. In other words, the transportation system we built is totally safe, but only if you follow the rules of the road. But let's think about this again, because I would argue that the reality of human error is not nearly as simple. So, what is really behind some of these crashes? Here's an example from Vancouver, Washington. It's a crash. I happened to see it in the news the morning it took place. Two high school kids were walking to school early in the morning. They got hit by a driver in this pickup truck, 14-year-old and a 17-year-old. And when you think about a crash like this, how does it get classified in like the databases that we all might work with as road safety researchers or people trying to fix these problems? Um, One, if it's a speeding related crash, we do what the Colorado DOT did. We put out PSAs, tell you not to speed, right? But if you look at the roadway we put in front of the guy who was speeding, like here's a 5-lane arterial with a speed limit of 35. Like, is it a mistake to go more than 35? Probably not. When you think about the way we do things like design speed and the factor of safety mentality and speed limits, like look at this road here, and this was in Alexandria, Virginia. The speed limit is 25 miles an hour. Like, is this an error if someone's going that fast? And if it's not a speeding related crash, then it's a jaywalking crash. And these kids were jaywalking. So what do we do in that case? Maybe we look to a warrant and we try to figure out if we have enough people risking their lives in the peak hour. If we don't have 93 of them, we don't really do anything. So in most cases, what do we do instead? We put out a PSA telling kids not to jaywalk. For some reason, I gave a talk a couple months ago in front of the IEEE, the Electrical Engineer Society, and when I was putting that one together, it reminded me of this character. He was called Ready Kilowatt. If you're old enough like me, you might remember this as a PSA. And I was like, well, what would be the equivalent in terms of transportation? And I came up with this idea of speedy crosswalk. And first attempt, AI came up with this amazing image. Then I gave a talk at a bike conference, and this is the reckless rider version of it. But it's not that different from a lot of the real ones. Like there's one from Ottawa, Canada, and even though a lot of the research shows us that scare tactics can actually make things worse, we continue to try to do the same thing in order to scare people into behaving better. But if we take a step back and think about the situation we put these kids in, like that's where they got killed. The nearest crosswalk was pretty far away. And even if they walked to that crosswalk, I wouldn't really say it's the greatest crosswalk I've ever seen and would want to cross. If you think about the built environment between where the crosswalk was and where these kids were, yeah, there's some sidewalks, but a lot of them are missing or just straight up end out of the blue. If they try to cross those side streets, we have these huge turning radii where cars can be taking those side streets very fast, which feels dangerous as well. So when you think about why did they cross where they crossed, yeah, they jaywalked, but they also did what the built environment suggests they should do. Like they did something that makes perfect rational sense given the built environment we provided for them. And then we have the gall to tell these kids, well, they were wearing dark clothing. Of course they were. These are high school boys, right? What do we expect? Like we know that's going to be the case, so we can do something. If you go out there now, there's a memorial for these kids, but right behind it, you can see where the sidewalk just ends. Like, here's another example. Pretend you're on an arterial or something, taking a left turn. What's the signal going to be like? Well, it's either going to be permissive or protected. If it's protected, you get the green arrow, you get to go. In most cases, it'll probably be permissive. You get the green ball. And what are you trying to do as the driver? Right? You're looking for a gap in the oncoming traffic. In this case, we only have 2 lanes coming at us, but it could be 3, 4, or 5. You're looking for a gap to kind of shoot across to take the left turn. You might have cars behind you kind of giving you back pressure. What do we do at the exact same time? Like we tell the pedestrian on the side street, it's safe to cross. We put up the little white walk guy and say, go ahead, cross. And then if that driver hits the pedestrian, How does that crash end up in our database? Again, we could call it a human error crash. Like that driver did not yield the right of way to that pedestrian. How do we fix it? Well, we tell people we put a sign way over the road telling you to keep your eyes on the road. Or I gave a talk in Canada, and this is their version of that. In Colorado, we did this one. We did this giant eyeball campaign, where not only you but your dog needs to make eye contact with the driver before you cross the street. And like this is good advice for maybe me to give my kids, but it's probably not great advice coming from a state DOT. Like part of the reason I would argue is that what does this mean for the 12 million people in this country that are visually impaired or the 1.2 million people that are blind? Like they cannot make eye contact. And if they don't, does it mean it's their fault if they get hit? Nevertheless, our Colorado DOT put a bunch of their employees in these giant eyeball heads. And this is literally at the intersection right behind me, right out there, having them cross the street. Even if you look online, this video I found where this happens, they kind of blame this pedestrian for what happened. They say he needs to be more safe and take better precautions when he's out there crossing the street. And this all happens despite the fact that we even know that the A-pillar is in the way of where this driver could even see the pedestrian. Like, so to me, I mean, yeah, it's easy to blame it for human error, but at the same time, this is a systematic crash that is happening all the time. Like honestly, to the point where like you see just how much more prevalent it is in our data. And I remember I presented this as a research proposal idea to our Colorado DOT, and they were like, "Yeah, that's nice, and we know a lot of pedestrians are dying on our urban arterials with this, but we'd rather you try to see if drivers understand the flashing yellow arrow. Like, what do drivers think?" I was like, "Well, we could do that, but like, why? Like, this is where the real problems are." But from their perspective, this is just a human error crash that needs education. All right, so what's the problem with all this, with the way that we're classifying these sorts of crashes with this sort of human error thinking? Well, one, I think it lets us off the hook, and the other is it removes our feedback loop. The problem is that we don't even think we have a problem beyond getting people to behave better. So yes, we still make changes to our infrastructure. We'll put on a Band-Aid here or a Band-Aid there, but we don't have enough Band-Aids to fix all the problems that we have. Yes, we can maybe see some improvements by focusing on road user behaviors, but it really doesn't fix our fundamental and systemic problems. And if you look closely at our transportation system, particularly those arterials typically designed by our state DOTs, it's really hard to say that it's safety first. And I do love a lot of my friends and colleagues at Colorado DOT, and I gave a presentation there a couple of years ago, and this was their password. And at best, I would say it's safety third, in the way we actually do things and the way our protocols are set up. So we can do better. But it's not this, right? It's not going to be designs like this. I see examples all over the place, and it's hard to say that every lane is a bike lane. And not only do we blame one road user or the other for crashes like this, like in a crash like you see here, a Doring crash, we don't blame anybody. This does not even get into our crash databases because there was no moving car in it. I think Chicago is the only city I know of in our country that collects the data systematically. Sharrows were actually invented here in Denver. They ended up in the 2009 MUTCD without any safety research backing them up. All the research was just on where bicyclists bike before and after Sharrows in comparison to like the curb or the parked cars, and where drivers are in comparison to the bicyclists. When Chicago finally started collecting that Doring crash data, this was maybe 2010. Our initial look at this subject found that Sharrows, in terms of safety, were worse than nothing. And I was on a podcast around that time talking about this, and this guy, he was James McKay, he was the inventor of the Sharrow. Like this is what he was suggesting, that he was always under pressure to do less. And for him, Sharrows were as little as he could do. But I think a lot of cities are beginning to realize that what was considered a good bike facility 10 years ago might not be so today. I mean, Davis, you guys are obviously ahead of the rest of us in this sort of thing, but you go to most cities now, and this is, something like this is like at the best of the best. This is like best practice. But I would say we might be rethinking this sooner rather than later as well. Like last summer, I was at IT International in Philly, And I think 2 days before I got there, this woman, Barbara Freed, she's a pediatric oncologist. She was biking out there and she was killed by a driver. So the night I got to Philly, I went over to the crash site. There was already a big memorial set up. You look at the infrastructure we provided her, a lot of people will say this is exactly what we do want, right? We have the flex post, there's a bike lane. What ended up happening is I think an older driver, maybe he was confused, thought the bike lane was a car lane. Whatever happened, he drove right into it, right over her, and killed her right there on the same street. Um, but when you think about these flex posts, like what are they actually designed for? They're designed to pop back up at 70 miles per hour. That is the intent of those design. Like we could put out a real bollard, like maybe one that dissipates some energy from the car while also protecting the cyclists. Like we are more than willing to do so for our electrical transformers, our buildings. Philly's interesting because they do have them in between the curb and the pedestrians. What I heard, this is actually to keep cars from parking on the sidewalk. This is not to protect pedestrians. But in the case of the street where she was killed, like if this real baller that you see in the foreground is placed in the background, like she'd be alive today. So one thing I did recently too is try to just sort of figure out how many cumulative deaths we've had over the years. So I just started adding these up from when we started collecting this data in the late 1800s. So 1899, we had 26 car-related crashes. You can see where we hit the 500,000 thresholds or the million total deaths in the 1950s. And by then, that was already more than any of our wars combined, American troops had died in. 2 million deaths in the mid 1970s, 3 million. And around this time last year, we would have crossed the 4 million death threshold, even though this data is not completely out yet. I also tried to estimate how many of these are pedestrians and how many of these are cyclists. So if you keep following these trends, we're going to get to 1 million of those deaths by the end of this decade, which is a lot. Like even Lego acknowledges we have a problem. So how do we fix this again? If we want to keep sticking our head in the proverbial sidewalk, we can keep doing what we always do, just keep telling people safety is a shared responsibility. And even when you look at the safe systems approach, like we're still doing the same thing, just telling people this. And I found this same rhetoric like dating back to the 1950s. This paper's from 1955. And so the other thing people would say in how we fix this might be technology. We can just hope technology saves the day. Um, I was on my sabbatical in Australia in 2017. I was in Sydney and they used to do this thing called City Talks where they had speakers from all over the world come and give talks about transportation. In this case, there was a professor from MIT that came and he was showing this amazing animation of a autonomous intersection where every car going through it is getting a reservation essentially, and it can just fly through. And you compare that to a traditional one where cars are sitting there waiting for the light to change. And he declared the autonomous intersection the future of urbanism. And he got a standing ovation from like the 200 people sitting there in the crowd. And I'm just sitting there thinking, like, what the heck? Like, what happens if there's like one bicyclist or one pedestrian or even one human driver? Like, that autonomous intersection doesn't work whatsoever. And you know what? This starts becoming more of like a social cultural issue because guess what? People love their cars. Like if everybody was in an autonomous car, like we get a lot of those benefits, but the reality is that's not the case. And it's hard to even imagine when that would be the case. If you've read Peter Norton's book Autonorama, like he shows that technology has been this carrot dangling in front of us. And it's always been like 5 or 10 years ahead of us, and we've never caught it. And you can see the same sort of vicious cycle where we sort of think technology is going to save the day in the 1950s and again in the 70s and again in the 80s and 90s and now again, and we've never quite got there. And we're saying the same thing now, but if you look at the most recent studies I can find on self-driving cars, they're safer except at dawn, dusk, or whenever they're turning. Or if you've seen Mark Rober's recent YouTube video where he basically played the Wile E. Coyote trick on a Tesla and it drove straight through the wall. Uh, anyway, so for me, it's hard to get super excited about technology saving the day when we can't even get our sidewalks right. And like these pictures here are ones I just took in and around downtown Denver. this is a major US city. Like this one's right here on my campus. Like this one here, you can see we have a ADA accessible curb ramp. We have in the background, you probably can't see it, but there's a bus stop there. And we can't even give people sidewalks in a major city like Denver. Or this is an example where this is the sidewalk to our, multi-billion-dollar light rail investment. And we can't even be bothered to give them a sidewalk to get to that. And you sort of wonder why people would rather stay in their cars than take the bus. Or sometimes our sidewalks aren't even wide enough. This is something that Carrie might have warned me about, but I took my students on a tour of the neighborhood. I bought a couple wheelchairs. I bought these little, you can see in the background, people have these goggles that give them different visual impairments. But we learned a lot about what it's like. I called it the empathy week. We really sort of learned a lot about design and the way we took that tour and what we saw and what we felt and that sort of thing. When you think about this guy, there's a sidewalk that's not even wide enough for his wheelchair. If he gets hit by a driver, how does that end up in our crash database? It ends up as a human error crash. And again, to me, this is on us. We need to do better than a lot of things we're doing. So the last thing I want to leave you with is, a lot of what I found going down these rabbit holes is we kind of as a discipline, we put much more stock than in our theories, such as the idea of forgiving design or bigger is better, over and above the empirical results. So like, it makes sense in maybe some disciplines, but this is especially important in transportation, maybe not to do this, because a lot of what we do in transportation is so counterintuitive. Like you've probably heard the idea that a sharp knife is safer than a dull knife because you don't need to apply as much pressure, that sort of thing. And there's so much stuff you could point to in transportation where you get the same counterintuitive results. Yeah, I remember my first month of grad school, we had a symposium just like the one you're in now, and the speaker came in to talk about rumble strips. And again, the issue was runoff through road drivers. So they had invented rumble strips back in the 80s in the Pennsylvania Turnpike, and they learned that they reduced runoff the road crashes by like 70%. But the study that I saw being presented to me in that first month of my grad school experience, they talked about what was called crash migration, where there's an increase in another type of crash. In the case they were looking at, they had a lot more side swipes and a lot more head-on collisions because people would, start veering off the road, they hit the rumble strip and they jerk the wheel the other way. And it sort of started leading me down these rabbit holes of how things are so often counterintuitive. So how do you fix, that problem they have? And you see places start doing this, and like neither of these are maybe great for bicyclists. Like one of the other examples I found in the book was this edgeline studies from I think it was Ohio and Kansas from the 1950s, where their theory was we need to add edge lines to every roadway. It's going to be safer. They actually did a randomized control experiment and they found out it wasn't safer. But they're like, that doesn't make any sense. And they went ahead and they just did the edge lines anyways. Or even now, when you look at retroreflectivity, Colorado DOT came to us looking to do a study to try to use like machine learning and that sort of stuff to figure out when they need to replace their markings due to the disintegration of retroreflectivity, because it might be different in the mountains than Denver, that sort of stuff. I was like, well, that'd be nice, but could we first check out the safety, like try to do something to understand whether it helps safety or not? They're like, no, we don't really care about that. We just want to know when we need to replace them. And if you look at the research that actually digs into that a little bit, I will say it's not a complete research strand that's really, to the point where you want to follow this advice yet. But the best research you can find was this study from California where they looked at right after the lines were replaced, and that was when they should be the best of the best in terms of retroactivity, and over time it diminishes. And they found the best safety was much later. The worst safety was right after they replaced the line. So with a lot of stuff, it's not going to be as simple as we think. So what we need to do maybe, I'm not trying to get you fired up about retroreflectivity or that sort of thing, but I want you to start flipping your thinking and try to put empiricism over our theories. Because if we continue on the path with our theories, we end up with those high entry network roads like we've started with. When I was up in Toronto too, I visited the St. Lawrence neighborhood, and I mentioned this in the book a little bit because this is a neighborhood that I think his name was Alan Littlewood. He was designing this, used to be an industrial area. This was back in the 70s. And he was going to commission all these traffic engineering studies to try to figure out what he needed to build there. Jane Jacobs had just moved to Toronto right before this, and I think her husband maybe worked with him or something like that. There was some connection. So we sat down with her to try to figure out whether he was on the right track path. And she's like, not at all. Like, forget all those studies. Just go to the parts of Toronto that everybody loves, the parts that still work today, even though they might have been built before traffic engineers ever existed, and literally measure them. Like, try to use empirical measurements to try to figure out what would work. Like, how big the buildings need to be, how far setbacks need to be, what our curb radii need to look, all that sort of stuff. And that's what he did. And if you go down to that neighborhood today, I mean, the architecture is really 70s, but the streets are amazing and it still works. So, what should we be doing? I would argue that instead of sitting around waiting for folks to get hurt and playing whack-a-mole with safety, we need to flip our thinking. And towards the end of the book, I do talk about Marie Kondo and the way she focuses on categories. So, the way she thinks is like instead of going from room to room, or in our case, going from like intersection to intersection, like waiting for people to get hurt to try to fix the safety problem, she wants you to sort of put all your clothes in one place. And by doing so, you kind of get a sense of the scale of the problem that you have. And we could do the same thing when thinking about road safety. So instead of playing whack-a-mole, like come up with something sort of more fundamental, like what could be a category worth thinking about. And one of them might be kids. Like focus on kids and what we need to do. Like this might be realizing that kids don't exactly walk as briskly across our crosswalks as we believe. So maybe we need to design differently around those places. Or if we're going to use technology, why not use it to give a meandering kid a little bit more time, or give an old guy like this a little bit more time to cross? Or if you've seen that investigative report out of Indianapolis where they remember that mom in an SUV, I think she had a Cadillac Escalade, and they had 13 kids sitting in front of her car, and she could not see a single one of them until the 14th kid sat down. What would that mean for us in terms of design? Like maybe we need to set the the stop bar way back. And the same goes for intersections. Like when you start seeing videos like this, we can start designing these things very differently with kids in mind. Like Denver's done this thing with this inverted pyramid. We're supposed to prioritize like pedestrians. We don't really do this in practice, but pedestrians at the top, and at the bottom would be drivers, and in between you see bikes and transit and freight. Like we could even put kids at the tippy top of this. Like what would that actually mean in terms of how we design? I mean, I was always taught to design from the center line out. So we sort of start at the center line, figure out how much space we need to allocate to cars. We start working our way out. At the end of the day, whatever's left over, we maybe give the pedestrians. What if we flip that? We'll start from the outside in. How much space do we need to give pedestrians first? And then work our way in, and whatever's left over at the end of the day might go to cars. And if we did something even close to that, we would not end up with streets like this one, ever. It might be something closer to this. One more thing I would say, I was thinking of this recently when I was doing a tour. Just you see these old sidewalks, and when contractors will stamp their name on them, and like they're still in great shape today. Some of them I've seen like years, like 1950s or whatever. Like maybe there's something to be said for sort of putting our name on stuff. Like maybe traffic engineers could put their name on the streets they design, so people sort of know. Yeah, there might be if contractors putting their name on the sidewalk, they might spend a little bit of time making sure it cures or whatever it is to make sure it lasts. Um, when I was walking up and down Federal Boulevard, that's a street in Denver near our DOT that is the worst of the worst in terms of safety. It was disconcerting to see my own name like right there on Federal Boulevard. So I would not like that if my name is on a street like this, and maybe something that kind of stupid might help the cause. And the last thing here is it's not just about design. Like this really makes a difference in people's happiness. Like we could make our streets, our intersections, like help in terms of making kids happier or making people happier, because this kind of stuff actually matters. I did a talk in Bentonville, Arkansas, and this is it's a route parallel to the multi-use trail for kids or anyone else that wants to kind of go off-roading can follow along. Um, the last thing I'll say is my oldest, she's now in college now, but when she was in elementary school, one of her science fair projects, she did this experiment where she would ask kids, she drew these kind of spectrum of happy to sad faces, and she asked them how they were feeling that day. After that, she asked them how they got to school, whether they got in a car, bus, bike, walk. And it was actually statistically significant that the kids that walked or bike were happier than the kids that were driven to school or on the bus. So this kind of stuff matters for that as well. All right, thank you very much.
Questions for what? Go for it.
Hi Wes, thank you. My question kind of comes from a personal experience that I had and then also ties to your what next type of point. I think a lot of the people here are very sympathetic to the points that you made about safety and are kind of in the right mind space. But how do you see with your book kind of having somewhat of an activist or advocate lens to it? Being an activist or advocate in the workplace when you feel like as an entry level engineer, there's people in your workplace who aren't thinking about safety in the way that we've been taught, especially from Dr. Watkins and also from your book. But yeah, how do you think, maybe it has to do with interpersonal aspects, but how do you think that we can be proving our ideas without it being in these manuals, talking to superiors in a way that helps to make a project safer?
Yeah, it's interesting because I don't consider myself an advocate whatsoever. Like I feel like I'm a researcher. I'm trying to point out in my book, I would say most of what I'm doing is objective. Like the subjective stuff is more my opinion on pulp culture or sports and stuff that's in the book. Everything else is like me pointing out the research or the lack of research and that we need to actually do a better job of researching these things. So I'm trying to point people in that direction. I mean, the title might come across as advocacy, but I think if traffic engineers actually read the book, they'll realize I'm not actually blaming them. It's just like we're doing what we were taught, and what we were taught isn't quite what we were led to believe. So it's not necessarily our fault. It would only be our fault if we can kind of continue on this path. Like, how do you get that across? It's tough. It sort of depends the context, the culture. I mean, I always say it's hard. I mean, I can't go to a traffic engineer here and say, here's what Davis is doing. Like, look how amazing this is. Because their eyes glaze over and they don't pay any attention. It's like, oh, that's Davis. We can't do that. And you see that all the time. People saying, oh, look what Amsterdam's doing or Copenhagen. You sort of need to find examples that are more culturally relevant to your location. But that also speaks to trying to figure out what works best in terms of getting these points across. And it depends upon the culture of whether it's a state DOT or a city or a research group, whatever it might be. In some places, a little bit of, I don't know, maybe making fun of people helps. In other places, that doesn't work. I don't know. It's going to be different. And so there's no easy answer to your question. It really depends on context.
So then, sorry, to follow up a little bit on that, maybe to get a little bit more specific, with NACTO's new guide coming out seems to give more tools to engineers to make roads safer. And then also you talk about in the book a bit about engineering judgment, and how do you think that could maybe be used to push more innovative ideas that go against the grain of what you're criticizing?
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes hand in hand with liability to some extent because a lot of engineers, sort of think they just have to follow what all these guidelines are telling them for fear of being sued. So that engineering judgment section, I'm trying to show them that you have a lot more leeway than you think. I'm sure some of them know it, but I think a lot of them didn't really realize how powerful engineering judgment could be. And it was, useful when traffic calming became a thing 20 plus years ago. And they were able to get stuff done. And, the liability fears that people were worried about didn't really come to fruition back then. And like now, maybe there needs to be a shift in terms of that too, because I don't know if what we're doing is knowingly leading to dangerous situations, like that should be a liability issue in itself, even if we are following those guidebooks. So, I don't know. Again, there's not an easy answer to this sort of stuff, but I think I was trying to give engineers the tools and wherewithal to do better and not just fall back on the, hey, my hands are tied type thinking.
Cool, thank you.
had a question about the rabbit hole they had to dive into in order to find a lot of these older manuals and how to find their references and such. So like, how long did that process take in terms of writing this book? What were like the really major roadblocks and were there any places where it's like, oh, suddenly we found like a new reference in like this old library and now we found a breakthrough and such? I'm just curious about that process.
Yeah, no, I mean, it took like 3 years to be honest. Like I spent 18 months just reading all these old manuals and books, and you would every time you got to what you thought was the bottom, it'd end up going deeper, and it kept going and going. At one point, because I was taking notes and everything as I go, and like sort of typing things out, I literally had 1,000 pages of notes that I printed out. I'm sitting here at my desk, like thinking I'm a crazy person. It's like, oh my God, what did I get myself into? What am I going to do with all this? How do I turn this into something that makes any sense? And around that time, I read Robert Caro's book called Working. Robert Caro wrote the Robert Moses book and the LBJ books, and he talks about his process and how like, he was a whole nother level of crazy beyond me. Like he moved to Texas and like lived in LBJ's hometown for a year just so people would talk to him. So I felt a lot more sane after that. And I just kept trying to kind of put together the puzzle in my head, and it took a while, but and part of the problem was I was not on sabbatical or anything at the time. But to be honest, COVID helped because I could just close my door and nobody would talk to me. I wouldn't see people for like a week at a time, which helped my costs quite a bit. Yeah, but overall it took like 3 years to do all this.
Other questions for us?
Thanks, Liz. That was very nice to see like all the pictures and examples. I was wondering, so like it seems you are hopeful, but I want to hear your opinion on about like Vision Zero policies. Do you think that approach will actually help the US have safer cities? And yeah, what's your take on Vision Zero?
I mean, to be honest, not really. Like, is it not because Vision Zero itself is the wrong direction, because it feels like we haven't actually tried it. Like, if we like Vision Zero is supposed to be an ethical shift towards like zero fatalities. And if that is really the case, like what would we do? We we wouldn't allow any car to go over 20 miles an hour in a city, right? Like that is what we would do if that was really what us attacking Vision Zero. But what we've actually done in reality is we've, kind of done where Boulder started with this. Like we looked at the data, we saw the human error problem, and we went focusing on education and enforcement. And to be honest, it's just a new name for the same stuff we've always done. So Vision Zero hasn't failed because Vision Zero is bad. It's failed because we haven't really tried it yet in a lot of places.
I thought it was interesting to see Denver's like deprioritizing cars kind of at the bottom of the pyramid. And I had seen or heard about that in like maybe a Norwegian city that actually at some point achieved Vision Zero. So even though you said it's kind of, they're not actually doing it yet, I feel like even seeing a city phrasing it that way or showing it that way is kind of like pretty progressive in terms of US cities. Like, do you feel hopeful that it will move in the right direction eventually?
Some cities, I feel like I was looking at Boulder recently, and they've moved on past like the idea that we need to focus on education and enforcement to other stuff. So they are definitely moving in the right direction. Denver, yeah, to some extent, I mean, I think we're so much better than we were when I got here. And you see those manuals, like, oh my God, that's amazing. And it is, but we don't always put our money where our mouth is on the actual streets. At the same time, I remember when NACTO was here a couple of years ago, and I was taking, these bike tours and walking tours with people coming in from all over the country. And these people are like freaking out how great some streets were. And sometimes you need to take a step back and like, oh yeah, that is much better than it used to be. Like we're definitely heading in the right direction. At the same time, I'm sure it's the case for a lot of us. Our job is to kind of criticize to some extent, like what we could be doing better as opposed to just praising, and it's easier to kind of fall into that. But you're right. I mean, we're definitely heading in the right direction in a lot of cities. Maybe some are backtracking a little bit now, but it's for other issues maybe.
Jen?
Yeah, I'm quite interested about parking issue, as you mentioned that there's some parking there. The parking space is more wide than the people need. My question is, because the parking is one of the specific zoning requirement, if the project, like a development, they cannot provide enough parking space for apartment, like a new apartment, maybe their project will be banned. So is there any alternative way to like help people reduce the parking and they can successfully process the project?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's not even just parking too. I think land use is part of it as well. We sort of underestimate land use as a potential safety intervention. And a lot of that stuff feels like it's outside of the purview of us as maybe engineers, maybe more on the planning side or the municipal ordinance zoning side. But those things play a role in safety too. So I mean, you can dig into Donald Shoup's work. He has so much amazing stuff on that. But Denver's currently, I saw an article this morning how Denver is close to eliminating minimum parking requirements citywide. I think for a decade we've not had them downtown, but I mean, you can still see, maybe you can't. There's a new skyscraper right behind me, or there's still like 8 floors of parking in it. But that was the developer doing that, not the city forcing it. So maybe it needs to be taken a step further into having parking maximums, or yeah, I remember there's one city in Oregon where they don't give a maximum number of parking spaces. They give a maximum amount of land that could be dedicated to parking. So there's interesting ways you can do it. But it's not safety neutral, I think is what I would say, is that it's part of all of this. It's not just a separate decision.
One or two more, go for it now.
Yeah, so I want to go back to the last part that you mentioned, answering my first question, with the liability. Are there or have there been measurable differences in the amount of liability claims? Is that something that you look at as changes are made over time to NACDO guides? Because that is something I've heard in the workplace about liability moving away from certain standards, but is that something that's been measured or that you've seen being issues?
I've not seen any recent studies on it. Like the one I talk about in the book is a study by Reed Ewing, back with the traffic calming stuff. And what he found is that it wasn't nearly as much of an issue as people were scared of. And I go through what's called the rational process, where it's kind of like a tactical urbanism experiment sort of thinking. Like if you can establish with data that you have a problem and you're setting out with some clear alternatives and explaining why you're picking the one you pick to try to solve that problem you laid out. And then if you start collecting post data to see if you fix the problem, like those simple steps can, can help protect you from any of those liability issues. Like if you're just doing stuff willy-nilly, it it's not going to help. And that would be even the case with like the NACTO stuff. Like just because it's in some of these guidebooks, we should still be collecting before and after data, still trying to make empiricism a part of our design. Because to me, design is iterative. Like we need to treat it as more incremental than maybe we have in the past and continue to learn and improve from these things. And I think historically, we try to put out the end all be all on day one. If it doesn't work, so be it. But if we really want to get roads to be safer and protect ourselves from liability, it should be more iterative.
That's a great plug for my class. Anybody else? One more, Maha can have the last word.
Thank you. Thanks for the talk, but it's really interesting to kind of hear about the history of all of the designs of our highways that we see, and yeah, really fascinating talk. So I feel like one thing I think about is, and confirm, like tell me if I'm wrong or what your thoughts are on this, is that local governments are more likely to experiment with new designs as compared to state governments. Like there's more hesitation in DOTs. So Susan Handy has this student, Amy Lee, who wrote a really cool dissertation about like the politics of highways. I think You might enjoy that read as well. But it's all about how Caltrans is just stuck being this highway producing monster. They don't know how to be any different. Sorry, Caltrans, but that's how it is. So I don't know, what are your thoughts on that? Like, how do we break away from these patterns that are now like kind of like politically part of our, you know, like it's not just about AASHTO anymore as much as it is about surroundings of Caltrans. Labor unions need to be satisfied. They just want to construct and construct. Meanwhile, HSR is super expensive. So I don't know, how do we break away from that?
Yeah, I don't disagree. I mean, I think anecdotally, from what I've seen, yeah, the state DOTs are definitely more set in their ways, as compared to the local governments that are doing more innovative stuff and probably leading to safer places. But I like maybe that's where liability can flip. Like if you just continue business as usual and it's failing, like you should be liable even if you are following the manuals. At the same time, like I mentioned, I gave a talk over at the Colorado DOT. Like that is one of the DOTs, and I've heard there's been a few that have actually banned my book from their library. At the
Oh.
same time, those same DOTs have had secret book clubs with my book, and they've had me come talk to them and do Q&As or give a presentation about this. So within all of these DOTs, there are groups of people that want to do better, and they are trying to overcome those obstacles. So there are people in the state DOTs, I'm sure it's the case of Caltrans, that really want to do better and they want help as to how. So to me, that's our job as researchers to give them maybe the ammunition, it might not be the right word, but you know what I mean, to give them the research to help them push in the right direction.
Awesome. Can we thank Wes again?